So today we are finally going to discuss the long-awaited, much anticipated topic of the afterlife. We're going to begin today with heaven because it's the most logical jumping off point. We will cover hell and purgatory and all these other concepts as we move forward. There's a huge emphasis in Christianity on the afterlife and what comes next and what's after this. There's a lot of pop culture surrounding this topic, and it's difficult sometimes to sort out what is pop culture saying and what does pop culture tell us that is true and what does the Bible tell us that is true. So starting with the Bible, there are many Bible verses that talk about heaven or allude to the afterlife. And the problem with these, and the reason we can't just read these and go, there you go, that's heaven, is that a lot of these are symbolic, and some of them are not. So it's tricky because as we start to look through these different Bible verses, we need to try to sort out what's symbolic and what isn't. And perhaps the most important Bible verse we should start with when we're looking into what actually is heaven are these. Eye has not seen and ear has not heard all that God has prepared for those who love him. That's 1 Corinthians. And for you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night, i.e., you're not going to see it coming. The point here being, I think we're explicitly told by the Bible that we shouldn't be trying to guess what the afterlife looks like, and we especially shouldn't be trying to predict, when the end of the world is going to happen, or when we're going to die, or what eternity is going to look like. But having said that, we wouldn't be theologians if we didn't at least try. Now, unfortunately, I think we have to begin with this pop culture reference of both heaven and hell. Art allusions in the Bible are all going to point to heaven being this city in the clouds where the streets are paved with gold and the gates are made of pearls. And then, of course, hell on the other side is described often as this lake of fire where souls of the damned are tormented for all eternity. But the problem with both of these pictures is that they largely come from, yes, the Bible, but parts of the Bible that are used to be symbolic or sort of give an attempt at the spiritual state of things after death. For example, when heaven is described as being built on these pillars and, there's 12 gates and the gates are made of pearls and different parts of the city are made of different precious stones, you have to remember that all of these descriptions of heaven are coming from the book of Revelation, where John is writing to Christians who are being persecuted under the Roman Empire. And so a lot of John's writing is coded. What he's really trying to do is give Christians hope for the future. And he's using precious stones, numbers, anything that has symbolic importance for the Israelite people, because he's trying to, or at this point, I guess the Jewish people, because he's trying to give them hope that eventually things are going to turn out okay. He's not trying to tell us this is exactly what heaven's going to look like. He's using this description of heaven as sort of a coded message for the truth behind things. And then you have hell, which is often described as a lake of fire. But to understand why we have this symbolism or this imagery of a lake of fire, you have to remember back to when the Israelites invaded Canaan. There was this temple to this god called Moloch, where the Canaanites allegedly were making human sacrifices, children sacrifices, actually. So the Israelites thought this was terrible, obviously, and so they tore down the statue of Moloch. But there was this furnace where the Canaanites would make these burnt offerings, and it was on the outskirts of the city, and the Israelites, they tore down the idol, but they said, well, we don't want to waste a perfectly good furnace, so they started using it as a way to dispose of their trash. They would carry their trash to the edge of the city and huck it into this big furnace that used to be the temple to Moloch. Now, as time goes on, people start bringing their trash there, they're throwing it everywhere, and there ends up being this huge ever-burning fire on this hillside outside of what would be Judea. The landscape ended up probably looking something like this. It's just a huge pile of trash. It smells bad. It's always burning day and night. It sort of has the appearance of a lake of fire. And this place was known as Gehenna. Gehenna was a literal place where where the Canaanites would make burnt offerings to the temple of Moloch, and then later on that the Jews would burn their trash. But when the Jews then talk about hell being Gehenna or a lake of fire, they aren't saying that hell literally is a lake of fire. They were comparing separation from God to this literal place where there was fire burning day and night. By the way, if you go to Gehenna today, it's there's no more perpetual burning fire. I didn't want to get your hopes up. This is actually literally what it looks like today. I took this from a Google Street View of the place where Gehenna used to be. So obviously not as bad of a place anymore. But we're left in the lurch, because if we can't take these symbolic descriptions of heaven and hell for granted from the Bible, then we're sort of left on our own. So what do we know of God and the universe and whatever this thing, heaven or hell, what would it be? So what do we know? We know that imagery in the Bible was intended to be symbolic 90% of the time. We should probably start here. Forget whatever you think you know. Heaven is not floating in the clouds. It's not a city made of gold. If it was floating in the clouds, an airplane would have run into it by now. There's no city floating in the clouds. Likewise, hell is not literally under our feet. Hell is not literally a lake of fire. We need to start wiping our brains of all of this information that comes to us mainly just from pop artwork, right? Like most of our imagery about heaven and hell comes from artwork or from children's CCD books that, you know, just aren't really theologically accurate. So we need to forget everything we think we know about heaven and hell. What we do know is that we know that God loves us and created us in order to love each other. This is pretty clear from Genesis 1 and is clear throughout the whole salvation history story of the Bible. Yet, even though we were created for love, we know that people also continue to do evil things because of free choice. This is what we know. So using what we know, we now make deductive leaps into what the afterlife probably would look like, and then we match that against what we know of the Bible and what we know of theology, and we see if it fits. So let's start with heaven. We know that humans were created with intellect and morality. We know this from Genesis 1:26. We were created specifically to love. If you want to challenge me on these ideas, I talk about this purpose for creating the universe. What was the purpose of creating everything back in the Problem of Evil video? But if you take that for granted, if you assume that God created us and created the universe as an environment where love can happen, the natural end of this thing is to harvest, right? So yes, there's love, yes, there's evil, and these things grow together like your crops, your wheat, and the weeds that sort of are intertwined with their roots that you can't pull out until harvest season. So at the end of time, or when a person dies, it's harvest season. You harvest the love, you throw away everything else. So the natural end to a universe that is created to be an environment where love can exist is a perpetuation of that love and a getting rid of all the bad stuff. This final community of people is where all these people who have embraced love and embraced each other and forgiven each other can live in happiness. Now, I'm trying really hard not to use a lot of technical theology terms in this video because I don't think it's super helpful, but one that you definitely should be aware of because it's going to help us answer questions later on is this, the beatific vision. So the beatific vision is, for lack of more complicated terminology, God's revelation of the master plan to us. So there's a lot of times during life we'll ask questions like, why did this have to happen? Why did God choose to do things this way instead of that way? And the beatific vision, we believe, is this master plan that when we die, we get to see the beatific vision. We get to know once and for all why God did the things that God did during our lives. The trick with the beatific vision, though, is that if you know the answer ahead of time, it won't happen. I think a great example of this being true is the story of Abraham when he was asked to sacrifice his son. So you remember Abraham prayed and prayed for a son. Finally, God gives Abraham a son, Isaac, and he then immediately tells Abraham to kill his only son, to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham takes him up on a mountain. He's agonizing about this. It's a really horrible position to be in. And at the moment he is about to go through with it and kill Isaac, God comes in and says, wait, Abraham, don't do that. Just kidding. And we talk about this in the Bible as a test of faith. This is literally what we call it, a test of Abraham's faith. The problem, though, is that when we hear the words test of faith, we assume that this means God is testing Abraham to see if Abraham's going to do it. And by that, we imply that God doesn't know whether Abraham's going to do it. Because if God has to test something to see if it's going to work, that means God doesn't know if it's going to work, but God knows everything. Which means God doesn't need to test anything. So then, what was the point of testing Abraham? The point of testing Abraham is not so that God can find something out or see if Abraham's going to do it. The purpose of testing Abraham is to show Abraham what he himself is capable of. God wants Abraham to know that he's capable of sacrificing everything, even his own son, to follow God's will. So God never wanted Isaac to die, and obviously God never wanted Abraham to kill him, but the purpose of asking Abraham to do it was to show Abraham what he's capable of, because he's going to have to go through a lot of hard things in the future. If God at the start of the story just said, would you kill your own son for me if I asked you to? Abraham might say, yeah, I guess I would. But it's a sort of an empty promise, because until you're put in that situation, you don't really know. And Abraham doesn't really know what he's capable of until he's put in that situation by God. Then he knows, he has this revelation. The reason, at least what we can start to see of the reason that God puts us through a lot of the misery of earthly life, is that God knows we're going to come out stronger on the other side of these events, but we don't always see that. And if we did see it, and if God told us what the answer was going to be, or what good would come out of the evil that we're currently living through, then we wouldn't benefit from living through it. In fact, we probably wouldn't learn those lessons to begin with. So a lot of this stuff needs to stay hidden, but we are promised that when we die, God will show us these ultimate answers in the long run. Before we move on with our discussion of heaven, we need to talk about some misconceptions that exist in this conversation. Specifically, it frustrates me when I hear the phrase, the body dies and the soul goes to heaven. I hear a lot of Christians say this. It sounds logical, it sounds like it's what we believe, but it's actually not what Christians have believed from about as far back as our theology goes. The other comment that I don't like is this idea that heaven is a state of being. It's not a place, it's a state of being where souls just sort of float around praising God for all eternity. So number one, the body dies and the soul goes to heaven. I don't like this phrase, the soul goes to heaven. I am about to argue that when you die, you go body and soul into heaven. I think the body and the soul stay joined forever in heaven, and I will attempt to prove that in the upcoming slides. I don't like the phrase that heaven is a state of being. I think that heaven is a place. I think there are physical aspects to heaven. I also think there's a time aspect to heaven. I think there's time and space in heaven, and I will attempt to prove that as well. And then, of course, I don't like that heaven is just supposed to be this place where souls are floating around disembodied. That doesn't really make sense. That sounds like ghosts. It sounds like a haunted house. And then there's this idea that heaven is just people praising God forever. While praising God is a great thing, and I'm sure people are praising God in heaven, that's not all heaven is. That's not the whole purpose. It's not a bunch of souls floating around with harps praising God. It doesn't make sense. Souls can't even hold harps. They don't have hands. So when we say the person, we are talking about a thing that is comprised of body and soul. Your identity as a person is comprised of body and soul. Body is the stuff that makes you up physically, your arms, your legs, your torso, everything that's physical to you is part of your physical body. That is part of your identity. It's part of how you identify in the world. Then you also have a soul. You have your animating principle. So besides being a pile of stuff, physical stuff, you also have like a personality. You have character, you have a sense of humor, you have an intelligence. These are all parts of your soul. Your identity is both of these things, body and soul together. If we lose one, you are no longer a person. So if I take just your body and we get rid of your soul and all that's left is your body, we don't call a body a person, we call it a body, right? If you walk into a house and you find someone has been murdered there, you don't go, look, there's a person laying on the floor. You say, look, there's a body on the floor. There's a dead body. Even when we talk about it, we separate personhood from the body. So a dead body is not a person, it's just a body. On the other hand, if you walk into a house where someone's been murdered, the body's been taken away and buried, and you see like a ghost floating there, you don't say, oh, look, there's a person. You say, oh, look, there's a ghost. Or there's a soul of a departed person who's haunting this house. Again, not a person, just a disembodied soul. The person is both body and soul. When the two things are together, that's a person. Also, our entire existence, everything we know about the world, this world that we live in, has come to us through our five senses: taste, touch, smell, etc. All of these are parts of our body. Our body is how we interpret the world around us. If you rip our soul out of our body and then expect us to think or feel or be anything other than confused, I don't think you understand what it is to be human. The human experience is an experience of being in a body. Furthermore, to make the case that humans will have bodies in heaven, we have Jesus. Jesus, when he rises from the dead, rises body and soul. After the resurrection, Jesus touches his friends. He has physical contact with people. He hugs people. Thomas doesn't believe he's not a ghost, so he physically touches his hands and his side where the wounds were. Jesus walks around. He talks to people. He eats dinner with his friends. He behaves like a normal person. And of course, all of this is inside of a physical body. So Jesus sort of, in a lot of ways, sets the example for us for what to expect in the afterlife. Yes, he's Jesus, and he's sort of special in a lot of ways that we aren't, being God and all, but still, he is also a human, remember. He's 100% human, and so he is showing us, like, this is what's coming. Then, when Jesus enters heaven, he takes his body with him, which proves already, right off the bat, it proves something about heaven. It proves that heaven has a three-dimensional aspect, a three-dimensional space. Because if heaven was simply a state of being, there would be nowhere for Jesus's body to go. A body can't just enter a state of being. His body physically went somewhere, right? He was with the apostles one day, the next day, he's gone. His body has vanished. So, but his body didn't just cease to exist. His body still exists. It's just existing in another dimension somewhere. So heaven has the three-dimensional space. It has a body, at least one. It has Jesus's body walking around in it. So heaven has space. And at this point, I'm not going to pretend like I have all of the answers to questions like these, but I will say that the Apostle Paul had a really great analogy for something like what this might look like. And the analogy he uses is that of a seed that grows into a plant. A seed, like the one I've put on the screen, in some ways has an identity as a seed. It is what it is. A seed is a seed. But the natural end of a seed is not to remain a seed forever. The purpose of a seed is to be planted in the ground and to one day grow into a plant. Now, what's interesting in the world of biology is that if you look at the molecular level at the seed and at the plant, they are identical organisms. They are genetically the same. Their DNA is identical. That seed is the plant that it will grow into. It's not that the seed stops existing and the plant begins existing. It's that the seed is just a very early on version of the plant, even though it itself is its own thing. It is a seed that will grow into a plant. The human body has an identity of its own, the same way a seed does, and like a seed will one day need to be, and I'm using air quotes, planted in the ground. When a body dies, it is put into the ground. And then out of that same genetic material, we blossom into something new and something perfected. So Paul is basically making the illusion that we will still have a body. It is the same genetic material that our body was on Earth, but perfected in the same way that a seed grows into this awesome plant. Now, the last thing we need to talk about today is the concept of time, specifically how time exists or doesn't exist, or exists in a slightly different way in the afterlife. So the question we should start off with is, will there be time in heaven? We'll start with this line from the Bible. A day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. We're starting with this idea that God's time and our time are different. Now, that doesn't mean that God or heaven doesn't exist in a kind of timeline. It just means that heaven's timeline is going to be different than Earth's timeline. A great example of this was a book by C.S. Lewis that was then made into a movie, made into several movies, called The Chronicles of Narnia. The first book being The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In this story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you have these 4 children who, during a game of hide and seek, wander into a wardrobe and are transported magically to this realm called Narnia. And while they're in Narnia, they have many adventures and they experience magic and all this great stuff happens before they eventually find their way back. But a part of the story that a lot of people don't remember is the fact that these kids were in Narnia for about 40 years. They were in this magical world for about 40 years, even growing up and becoming old. They become kings and queens of Narnia. They live an entire lifetime. And then one day, having at this point completely forgotten about their old life back in England, they're wandering around in the woods and they accidentally stumble back through the same wardrobe that they had hidden in as children. But what's even more amazing is that when they fall back into the real world, that no time has passed at all. They are the same age as when they enter the wardrobe. They're wearing the same clothes, and they're actually coming back at the same moment. So what's interesting about this is obviously that time has passed more slowly in Narnia than it has in the real world, but also that while they were in Narnia, their perception of time hadn't changed. They felt as though they had lived for 40 years. So to talk about what this has to do with heaven, we're going to start with what we call a timeline. This is something you should be familiar with from, I guess, math classes. The idea that time passes in this sort of linear way where, you're born here, you die here, and the space in between those 2 points is everything that happens in your life, right? Now, if we were going to map the passing of time in Narnia alongside the passing of time on Earth, it's tempting to say, okay, well, this timeline is Earth, like normal, and now we'll draw a second timeline up here for Narnia. But the problem with this timeline is that they're parallel, right? So if this is the moment the children enter the wardrobe, and then they fall into Narnia's timeline, as time passes for them in Narnia, the same amount of time is passing on Earth, such that when they return to Earth, it would be the same amount of time passed on Earth as passed in Narnia. So this isn't how we draw a timeline when time is moving more rapidly in one realm than the other. What it would look like is something more like this. So you start with Earth's timeline. The way we need to draw Narnia's timeline is actually almost completely perpendicular. So what's happening is, at this moment that the children enter the wardrobe, which is right here at the intersection of these lines, they enter the wardrobe, and from this point, after they've been living on Earth, they enter the wardrobe. From this point, we actually turn the graph this way, and then they spend about 40 years living in Narnia. And then at this point, on the Narnia timeline, when they actually find the wardrobe, they are transported back to Earth. But now that we have the timelines graphed this way, when they fall back to Earth, only a minuscule amount of time right here has actually passed, which accounts for the fact that them going into the wardrobe happened almost instantaneous. If any time passed, it would only be about seconds that passed while they were actually in the wardrobe. Now, if we understand that, we can take this same idea and take a look at what it looks like in Christianity for heaven and earth. So now the way I'm going to propose that this works for heaven is that there was a single moment in human history when the gates of heaven were opened, sin was forgiven, and everyone was once and for all welcomed in heaven. And that point in our earth timeline is right here, Jesus. What I'm proposing then is that heaven's timeline actually looks something like this. A perpendicular line that begins with the cross and moves in this direction. Meaning that heaven is this infinite moment. And as Jesus dies, allowing all of us to enter heaven permanently, we now have created this alternate timeline, which means it doesn't matter whether you died back here or that you've died back here with like Abraham, Noah, Moses, the ancient followers of God, or maybe you died here, which is modern times. It doesn't matter where you die. We all end up here. We all fall to the foot of the cross. And from this moment, we all begin a new timeline together, the timeline of heaven. So yes, time passes for us in heaven, but it's passing at a different rate. And it all comes down to perspective. For us on earth, if we're trying to decide where heaven is or where the body goes when you die, these are questions that are just sort of outside of our realm of possibility. And it's not until we start drawing graphs like this that we can see that a whole new reality begins for us when we die and we enter heaven for the first time. So that's where we're going to end today. Next time we have class, we are going to talk about hell and why this concept of eternal suffering is necessary, and especially why it was created by a God who supposedly loves us. But that's all for today, and I will see you next time.